This podcast is brought to you by Freewheel's buy-side technology, Beeswax. I know a little something about Beeswax. I used to be the CEO. You may know Beeswax as the industry's only bidder-as-a-service with customizable, transparent, and controllable buy-side tech, but it's evolved to be so much more. Beeswax creates a direct connection between advertisers and Freewheel's premium publisher supply that enables performance-driven CTV buying. Beeswax's tools are designed to connect linear and digital TV and create scale in a world with increasing third-party identifiers, so you can easily navigate the complete video ecosystem. To learn more, go to freewheel.com/beeswax/pod. That's freewheel.com/beeswax/pod. Welcome to the Marketecture Podcast. I have today a great show with the legend, Brian O'Kelly, along with Eric Franchi. We are continuing our antitrust coverage. We're going to talk about the case. We're going to talk about greening up ad tech. We're going to talk about a lot of really interesting things. We also want to let you know about our continued coverage in the Monopoly Report, the newsletter that's been going out daily about the coverage of the case. I'm here in Alexandria, Virginia, covering it. We will resume coverage on Wednesday when Google is going to be giving their rebuttal to the DOJ's case. And also want to let you know that this week's vendor interview is with Richie Glassberg of Safeguard Privacy. He's building workflows for companies to stay privacy compliant, and that may sound terribly boring, but actually the interview was really interesting. I learned a lot, so I would recommend listening to it. And that is free until next Monday when it goes behind the Marketecture TV paywall. All right, with all that said, let's introduce the person who doesn't need any introduction, the inventor of the ad exchange, the former CEO of AppNexus, the current CEO of Scope3, the only person who has ever fired me from a job. Let's come on. Brian O'Kelly. Brian, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Technically, I think I once got fired from a summer job that I was really bad at, but I kind of quit, so it doesn't really count. So no, thanks so much for recording this early on a Friday morning. So I just saw your videotape down in Alexandria, Virginia, and the real question was, how did you get away with only doing a video deposition, not having to put on a suit and get on the Amtrak?
Really good question. They actually told me to expect to be called, and so the whole week I had this maybe Virginia on my calendar. Hang on one second. Bye, Star. I promised that if we did an early...
Kelly's the family man. Say goodbye to his kids in the middle of the podcast.
Exactly.
We'll leave that in.
But yeah, no, and I actually was... I'm not sure. I think maybe in a jury context, my testimony would have been more interesting. I think from a judge perspective, because I was deposed and the things they wanted me to say were on video, I don't know if I added anything by being there in person.
Yeah. So the one thing that I think people thought was interesting about your testimony, unique that nobody else had said or reported on previously, was a story about how Prebid was not allowed as part of the IAB Tech Lab. Can you tell us that story?
Yeah. So, Prebid was invented by two rogue AppNexians on the publisher team. And they basically said, we're going to open source header bidding because it's, if we want to go, if we don't, Google has a huge advantage. But if everyone in the space were to use the same JavaScript, we could all compete on who can make the most money for publishers as opposed to who can sell them the best JavaScript hack. And so they built a whole mock-up of prebid.org. They had gotten all the code in GitHub, and they just said, we're doing this. And so I said, well, who owns it? Who should be the sponsor? And they said, well, obviously IAB Tech Lab, which had just been started. And so we took it to IAB Tech Lab. There was a big meeting with all of the board members, including Tom Shields from AppNexus. And it was the Google team there that said, no, this isn't appropriate. This is, specifically about hacking Google. And, the IAB should be hands off from commercial disputes or, some angle like that. And they were the biggest, and probably still are the biggest contributor to IAB. And so they said no. And so we said, fine, we're going to make an open source organization, which honestly, I think prebid.org now is potentially bigger than IAB Tech Lab. It's probably equally influential, it has incredible members, it's completely independent. I have nothing to do with it. I still have a t-shirt But I'm actually most proud of the fact that I have nothing to do with it. Like the fact that we were able to create something that is bigger than anybody involved in it. I think it's really set the standard for how industry organizations should work. And so in a sense, I'm actually glad it's not part of a trade association because they're just too vulnerable to influence and to stagnation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting story, and I think people knew that it was a separate organization, but hearing that it was backroom dealing or whatever you might call it was kind of a bit of a shocker. And I think you're right, Prebid has a lot of influence, and they have a conference coming up, I think, next month. We at Marketecture often partner with the IB Tech Labs. We're friendly with them as well, but I think it's an important piece of the history here. So I wanted to ask you, there was a lot of testimony from folks that had run ad servers saying that they couldn't compete with Google. And I think your testimony essentially said that it was really hard to compete the publisher ad server market. If you went back in time to AppNexus, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, would you have entered the publisher ad server market again?
I mean, if you look at where Trade Desk is today, they're supposedly building TV operating systems and getting closer and closer to the publisher with OpenPath and other things. It's very difficult in a market where all of your competitors are end to end. If you think about it, Criteo goes to the publisher, Adform goes to the publisher, Amazon goes to the publisher, Google goes to the publisher. The problem is going to the publisher isn't enough if you really need to make sure things are fair. And so I guess for me, defensively, the idea that I would always be vulnerable to an algorithm change at Google was just not viable. And so, look, I wouldn't want to do it. I would want someone else to do it. It's the worst business. But I looked around and there was nobody else positioned to do it. No one else could possibly pull it off. And so we invested, $100 million acquiring OpenAdStream from WPP and acquired YieldX as an independent company. That was another $100 million deal. And we spent a huge amount of money to get the pieces together to compete. And we did pretty well in Europe and lost every single deal in the US, including News Corp, who is an investor. And you heard Steph say on Stand like it was a $9 million hit to switch. I actually don't think that was true based on our numbers in Europe, but Google told them it was true. And who is going to lose their job finding out? And that's why the ad server market was so bad. It was like a public service. And we did go to the government and said, this is an unfair industry. And we did try to get them to pick up the case. In fact, that's the biggest mistake I made was not pushing harder to get this trial to happen when it still mattered to me.
Yeah. Both Stephanie Laser from News Corp and a fellow from Daily Mail presented evidence that they specifically did analyses of how much it would cost them to leave Google's ad server in terms of revenue from the ad exchange, which they would not be able to recoup. And the numbers were quite large. In the Daily Mail, I think it was like 17-18% of their total programmatic revenue would disappear if they switched ad servers, which I think is a pretty compelling sort of antitrust comment about the tie between the two.
Point is that if AdX were independent of GAM, it would have still been the same thing. Like we're confusing. Google refused to let AdX participate externally. Any part of the Google stack could have been split. It was just that AdX plus DV360 plus Google Ads plus GAM was a bundle. And so, that was the sort of problem with the whole thing was any one of those links breaks, Google no longer has a strategic advantage, right? So, that to me is still the point that I think is hard for everyone to figure out is Google would have done great had they just split off AdX and let DV360, they would look like Trade Desk. And I think they would have done much better, actually. I don't think they needed that tie at that point.
Yeah, I have to agree with you on that. I mean, the powerhouse is Google Ads, formerly known as AdWords. There's evidence that more than half of AdX revenue is Google Ads, and that without Google Ads, AdX would be kind of a middling ad exchange with much lower margins. So one question I've always had since AppNexus had such a strong relationship with Microsoft was an investor. Now it owns it. But before it owned it, when AppNexus was independent, you were sort of their, I don't mean this insulting, sort of their vassal state in ad tech. And why didn't that bundle work? Why wasn't Microsoft able to create the combo of ad server, ad exchange, and demand to produce a viable number two to Google?
First of all, thank you for saying that, because everybody thought that we were a WPP vassal state. And so that's a huge upgrade. I appreciate it. Our goal wasn't to create a bundle in that way. Our goal was to create a alternative to Google and Market. And actually, our big idea was, could we get Yam on the platform, Yahoo, AOL, and Microsoft, which at the time would have been a strong counterbalance. And we actually went down to Ross Levinson and Jim Heckman in Sunnyvale, and we had a deal penciled out. I actually found my notebook the other day from 2012 where we were like sketching out all the deal points. We were doing technical diligence. Like we were so close to having that deal done. And then Marissa Mayer came in as CEO and was like, no, which was very bad. Like there's some bad days in that story. But I think that was our concept, was not to try to fight the full Google stack, but to basically force them off that, monopoly bundle and to have something that they'd almost have enough leverage to force them to play fair. And I think we were close. And to your point, Microsoft on its own wasn't quite big enough to do that. Like their MSN's big, but MSN just doesn't compete with things like YouTube on a standalone basis. That's another thing about this trial that's interesting is it feels like YouTube is a little bit off the table in terms of the supply and demand bits. And it's a marketplace. Like you can't really understand the monopoly without recognizing that, they control the largest short form video source in the world at that time. Maybe TikTok is competitive now, but like it's all one big thing that you have to piece apart. We couldn't compete with that video content. That's why the Netflix deal happened, because Microsoft was like, how do we get a competitive, video piece to our puzzle? But, obviously lots of complications with that. So all of this goes back to the deep challenge of competing with the entire Google picture.
Yeah, both DV360 and YouTube are effectively off the table in this antitrust case. Although DV360 has been mentioned a lot, I think I've only heard the word YouTube once mentioned in the entire trial. So, like, you exited AppNexus to AT&T. Would it have been different if Google had not done what it did? I know you filed for an S1 at some point. Like, take us through any thoughts you have in retrospect, like in hindsight, for the last days of AppNexus as an independent company and how it might have been different.
I mean, imagine two things that were different. One was, in give or take 2015, we were kind of winning the DSP space. And they turned off YouTube and said it was only for DV360. Now, at that time, inside an organization like GroupM, like we were the DSP. And once that happened, Google went into them and said, hey, you have to use DV360. You can't use AppNexus for everything anymore. And that difference of a DSP as the platform to access the open internet was no longer true. They destroyed kind of our core value prop by saying that it wasn't open except for them. Like that's devastating, number one. Oh, and by the way, it qualifies for all the rebates that Google gives for search and everything else. Well, that's painful, because we can't compete with that because we're not a publisher, which is what they are. And then I think the other piece of it was this idea of AdX won't bid into other platforms. So every other SSP was open and theirs wasn't. And that made it kind of impossible to manage a lift and shift of like a News Corp. The thing that we knew was that it worked. Like when Axel Springer switched in Germany, they just moved AdX to be a waterfall. It worked. You can daisy chain AdX. It's just everyone was too scared. So had Google just said, yes, we are independent of Prebid versus GAM or Xandr versus, well, it's AppNexus back then, thank God. AppNexus versus GAM. Like, we would have won all those deals. We would have won every US ad server deal. They all used YieldX. We had the yield management platform they used. We had better algorithms. We could do, real-time merging of direct and programmatic demand. Like we had all this stuff. We had curation before anybody else. And this was a killer product that couldn't win in market. And I think we would have won. And I think, going back to those two decisions, the difference between AppNexus being a $50 billion company like Trade Desk and being a great outcome and a company I'm incredibly proud of, but that lost. I have to say, I wake up every morning and say, yeah, Google kicked my ass. And it pisses me off. I didn't deserve to lose to Google for those reasons. I might have deserved for other reasons, but not those reasons.
It's like you're at the poker table, you had pocket aces, and the other player just stood up and shot you.
And by the way, most people who play poker with me would love to do that.
All right, let's talk about greening ad tech. Please don't give me just a scope 3 pitch. But I want you to answer me the question. Okay, when someone comes up to me, after a cocktail or two, and they're like, should we really be investing in this? It seems like, is Brian up to something? Does greening ad tech really matter? Why should we care? That's a cynical point of view that's been said to me more than once. what should I say to that person?
I think you should say that we know that the programmatic ecosystem is deeply inefficient. We know that there's billions, if not tens of billions of dollars that are wasted through made for advertising content or, crappy intermediaries, or the fact that we're still happy with 30% of ads never even appearing on the page and getting paid for. Like, this is not a functional ecosystem, and it has a huge dollar cost. When I wrote the first article about supply path optimization in 2016, I was shocked to come back in this industry in 2021 and find out that the number one priority for everyone was SPO. Like, how is that possible that in 5 years, identifying a huge financial and efficacy cost to the industry had not been solved? And so I think I look at this as a proxy to that conversation, which is when you're a trader at, an agency and someone says to you, hey, if you press this button, you could save your client 15% of their money. Everybody says that. And sometimes you click it, sometimes you don't. Often you find out 2 months later that it wasn't real, or that, there's a better button, or they're charging you 28% for that 15. And so people are cynical and they get tired and they get burned out. And if I can say the exact same thing, but guess what? I can demonstrate that this will save a third of the carbon when you click this button, and it will get rid of MFA, and it will get rid of these non-viewable placements, and it will knock out a bunch of these, intermediaries that are just in the way of your spend working for your client. I think they stop listening after that 30% for the environment, and that's fine with me. But it's their planet. It's our planet. And if that motivates you, and if you want to go look at our transparent methodology, our completely open data set, if you want to see that we're a different kind of company that operates trying to make the internet better and trying to make the environment better, how could you prove to someone that? Well, that's what we've spent the last 3 years doing, is trying to say sustainable is safe, is clean, is performant, is efficient. Choose whichever adjective you want, but it's all the same thing. It's cleaning up the mess of an industry that we have for the good of brands, for the good of publishers, for the good of consumers, and yes, if you insist, for the planet.
So carbon is sort of like a indicator of waste. It's like the same way if you were a mechanical engineer and your devices were generating too much heat, you might realize that they could be more efficient.
Well, exactly. And if you save heat, you save energy, you save the environment, and you save money. Like, all those things are the same thing. So it's like, I don't feel bad saying, look, if you click the button, the big green Scope 3 button to make money, like, I'm cool with that, because I know that it will drive systemic change in the ecosystem, because every publisher out there who has a million things in their ads.txt and these things is like, wait a second, does that mean that buyers are turning me off? I should change this. Again, it doesn't matter if you click the button for profit or for planet. It still has the same impact down the supply chain. And we're seeing this actually, if you look at our data, the number of large publishers that have really nasty ads.txt setups has gone from half to one of the top 20 in the past 18 months. Like, that's actually a pretty significant change. And again, this isn't like the day that Jounce Report started. It's not the day that we started seeing, Ad Exchanger articles. It's very heavily correlated to the day that we launched GMPs and Climate Shield and came out with the Ubiquity report about 15% of spend going to MFA. Like, that's the moment where we started to see the world change.
So with all the talk about how this is a performance indicator, how long before we see the Scope 3 DSP or the Scope 3 SSP?
Oh my gosh. Hopefully never. I really, really don't think the world needs another DSP or SSP. There's just so much transactional tech. And there's, as we know, like, building these products is no joke. There's so much to do to handle all the integrations, all the financial flows, all the different bits and pieces. And also, of course, dealing with large agencies and their specific needs. So our sense was like, it's better to be a signal, a cost-effective signal that you plug in everywhere. Also, the world isn't just programmatic. And I think if you're one of our clients is Snap, and programmatic doesn't help them. Like, we need a business that can plug into all the different kinds of media. And so if you're a large broadcaster, you actually want to sell direct. If you're a major newspaper, you've got these amazing native formats that are incredibly green and incredibly efficient, and you don't make them available on programmatic. That's the other problem, is building an SSP or a DSP actually doesn't solve the business problems for anybody in the supply chain. We can fight over, is it an open internet or a premium internet or a programmatic internet or whatever. I'll tell you what, the amount of content out there that needs to have this lens is much greater than what you can address in a DSP. So it doesn't make any systematic sense for us to build into that ecosystem because our view and our aspirations are much bigger than it.
So this isn't in the notes, but I want to ask you a question you'll probably be interested in. To what extent do you think there's a AppNexus mafia of startups? There seems to be a good amount of startups created by AppNexus people. TripleLift and Rockabox come to mind. I think there's a bunch more. Are you following that? Do you track your alumni?
Definitely track my alumni. I don't think it's a mafia. There's a day right before the AT&T deal where, I knew this was going to be a massive cultural change. I took my senior leadership team, probably 100 people out, and I said, we need to have a funeral for AppNexus because it's never going to be the same from here. But we can all be AppNexians forever. Like our values, our beliefs, the skills, the relationships, like those will last way longer than AppNexus. Now, I had no idea that weeks later they were going to change the name, which I still think was the second worst rename other than Twitter. But I think that's a very low bar.
Something about the X gets people excited.
Exactly. People love the X. But I also, for years have been mentoring folks in this ecosystem. Even as a AppNexus leader, I was still working very closely with folks in the startup ecosystem in and around the business. I mean, the Invite Media guys pivoted from a social video network to a DSP in my apartment, and now that's DV360. And I would say that, Nat and Zach and the rest of the team, I learn from them, they learn from me, but having people in that learning mindset is really important. So the fact that you see so many people, not just founding companies, but being executives and leaders in companies, like that's what's great. And so many people say to me like, how did you get such a great group of people? And I keep saying, well, I tried to stay away from, choosing the people and more creating a culture where they could flourish, right? Like weed the garden versus trying to grow flowers. But yeah, I'm really proud of that. I think we're seeing that, go another generation as those people are getting more experience or becoming executives, moving into more significant roles. I mean, that's the best thing we ever did. And I credit Michael Rubenstein for this, for making this a huge priority, is how do we build a talent development pipeline that helps leaders develop and grow?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a really important part of the culture. All right. So the antitrust trial is 2 weeks in. So I believe that for our predictions for the year, Eric, we talked about what the odds were of a Google breakup. Yep. We have to go back and listen to it. And I think I said at January, it was 50-50, that in this calendar year, we would have a declaration that some spin out was going to happen. I don't know about this calendar year, giving it September, but I'm going to say the odds of them losing this case and Addix and DFP spinning out have gone up quite a bit to, I would even say maybe in the 75 to 80 range. I want to get both of you guys put a number on it. Let's just say, next 18 months that significant portions of the Google ad tech stack get spun out. Maybe Brian, you want to go first?
Yeah, but then I get to ask the question, is Google secretly happy about that?
They should be.
My take is actually that the thing I can't get my head around is if they're so good at being a monopoly, how did Jeff Green make $50 billion at Trade Desk? And how did I actually build a business that I could exit for like pennies on the Jeff Green dollar? Like, if it's a monopoly, either two things. They're a really bad monopolist. Look, we know all those folks. Like, they're not the brightest bulbs. Like, they could just be really bad at running a monopoly, right? But I also just kind of wonder if you're a judge being like, man, there's a lot of those big platforms out there that make billions and billions of dollars, and you guys seem to have let your competitors grow and flourish. I don't know. I'm skeptical. I'm going to go with 25%, even though I hear your point, because I don't think that the market definition or the outcomes here are representative of a monopoly outcome.
All right, 25%, Eric.
I go back and forth between taking the over, so align with you that it's 70 to 80%, and then not having deep knowledge of the definition of monopolist and like what the DOJ actually thinks of our industry in the context of everything, and then I go back to 50-50. So I guess I'll stay the middle, and somebody on this pod is going to win.
How can we prove you right or wrong? Like anything that happens, that's not a viable answer. Come on.
All right.
You've got to go one way or the other.
51, yes.
Okay, so if it doesn't get broken up, I'm back on this podcast. I was right. You were both totally wrong. Got it.
Yeah,
I'll accept it.
All right, with that, let's take a quick break and we'll come back with the news of the week. This podcast is sponsored by Adelaide. You've probably heard of Adelaide by now. This month, they announced a new product, Adelaide for Publishers. For the first time, publishers can leverage attention metrics to curate inventory, deliver attention insights, and drive higher CPMs. Join the Weather Company, NPR, Westwood One, Cumulus Media, and other leading publishers taking advantage of the attention economy's most popular metric, AU. Maybe one day Mark will convince me to sell guaranteed AU slots on Marketecture, but probably not. Check out AdelaideMetrics.com/AFP for more information.
All right, we're back. We've got a big news week. We've got Google launching either a clean room or a clean room killer, Viant with what might have been the biggest ad tech launch ever, TTD, back in the news for tvOS, a ad tech CEO going to jail for accounting fraud, and a bunch of other stuff. All right, before we get into it, give us an update from Virginia that you haven't necessarily put into the newsletter. Anything interesting? Any sort of additional stuff?
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure there's anything I haven't put in the newsletter, but I will say that I think the case has gone very well for the DOJ and the plaintiffs. They have laid out a lot of evidence, both people and data and documents that support, especially the DFP monopoly. I can't imagine that the judge doesn't declare DFP monopoly. That doesn't mean that they've abused their power. That's a second thing. But DFP evidence has shown it has 90% market share and that clients can't leave it and competitors can't compete. So if I had to really go into the depth of what I think is going to happen, I think there's going to be a pretty adverse ruling from the judge in this case that will mostly comport with what's being asked. I think Google will lose on most counts. However, there are these weird, very complicated antitrust legal issues that some of the lawyers have been whispering to me may make the case very complicated, especially on appeal. There's a thing called the Amex case where the Supreme Court decided that if you have a two-sided market and one side's a monopoly but the other side is beneficial to customers, that that's okay. So in the case of Amex, they charge high fees, which is sort of abusive behavior, but they give points to the cardholders, so that makes it okay. And there's also a case called Trinco, which is called the duty to deal, which says that a company cannot be compelled to do business with its competitors, even if it's a monopoly. And so there's a lot of questions, and Google's defense has made a lot of arguments that it would be a lot of work to make AdWords interoperable with other exchanges or AdX interoperable with other ad servers. They have a lot of documents saying it would be a lot of work. So I think there's a pretty strong appeal or legal way to get out of some of these things. So that's how it'll probably net out, in my prediction.
So Bach is going to be right.
I think none of us are going to know for at least a year unless Google finally comes to its senses and just agrees to spin this thing out.
Can Google reframe its agency rebate programs as a point system? So that
that would be smart. That
Google
was what I call them OMD points. That's really not come up in the trial at all, the agency stuff. I think it's because there was a pre-trial motion that you may have seen in the news that Google actually just paid the fine that was being accused of, and that eliminated the complaints from the individual advertisers who were government agencies. So a lot of the evidence that was collected from the Air Force and other government agencies just has not been part of the trial, and I think that includes most of the agency stuff.
All right. Good update. Thank you. All right, let's get into it. So Google this week launched what they're calling confidential matching, which basically sounds like clean room tech. It's there's a blog post. We'll put it in the newsletter. So basically, they're using TEEs, which are trusted execution environments, which sound a lot like clean room tech. And I think the interesting thing here, and would love your guys' take, is number one, it's at no cost to customers. So maybe this is another variation of the points. But then number two, it does seem to have some technical differences between what pure play clean room providers are doing and what Google is offering. So I guess the question is this a clean room killer or is just another piece of clean room type of tech? What do you guys think?
Is it just a safer way to upload data to Google Ads? Because so instead of sending them a bunch of emails, you have to process those emails somehow and then push them. That's not a clean room killer. That just sounds like better privacy by design tech that actually protects Google's frontier better. At least that was my initial understanding of this, is like, this is a good way for Google to do business with its direct customers. I didn't see this as being dramatically different than what you'd expect from any large publisher or platform that wants to give its customers the most privacy safe way to share data.
Yeah, I have to agree with Brian on this. The big question is, are clean rooms and privacy enhancing technologies products or features? And for a big platform like Google Ads, it's a feature. You want to be able to upload things in a privacy protected way. It really doesn't speak much to the viability of clean rooms as a software category, which is probably going to be determined by different types of customers and different types of use cases.
And just throwing out an idea, Mike, if you think about like the way it has worked traditionally, where you go into a DSP, let's say, or a platform interface, and you click on a bunch of targeting of audiences, the idea of just saying, I'm going to do all my audience processing on my side and then send you the result, and that actually has a lot of benefits for advertisers, because you're not paying third-party data fees. You don't necessarily have to disclose what you're targeting or why you're targeting or your user list. I mean, this idea of protecting your data, not even from a privacy perspective, but from an intent and knowledge perspective, I think there's a lot to be said for that, even from a market dynamics perspective. And so I actually think an interesting meta conversation here is there's pipes, right? Like, how do you push that data? If it's just Google, fine. But if you're a brand and you have like hundreds of supply partners, that's where there's a pipes conversation. And, I'm on the LiveRamp board, and a lot of what LiveRamp exists to do is to manage that in a privacy safe, but also scalable, efficient way. I don't know. I don't see most brands having the capacity to implement and integrate with all these different things. But this is the business case that we're now talking about, is a world where data is owned by a first party, connected to other things in a safe first party, processor kind of way, and then pushed to these parties. So I think we're moving into a privacy first future. And it's great to see Google going that direction.
I didn't know you were on the LiveRamp board. So now whenever one of my startups I advise says they can't get LiveRamp to return their calls, I'm just going to send them to you.
I know who to text. And if that is happening, I know who to call about that too.
Awesome. Moving on, just reach out to Buck. Viant AI. Did you guys see the video that Tim and Chris did?
Yeah, they gave me a preview demo a couple weeks ago to get my kind of feedback on it. Very impressive. Very, very impressive. I don't think it's perfect. I don't think it solves an entire use case just yet. But if you think about it as a getting started tool on what is a very manual task of creating media plans, I really like where they're headed.
It's exactly the kind of use case I think we'll see, which is, and same thing in creative, right? You don't use it for your final production, like TV creative, but you use it to like prompt and get ideas and get going. I mean, that's a huge step forward. And I think the, tweak version of this is the other one that we'll see of, hey, I need to add 50K to this plan. Can you distribute it across, the best performing parts of it? I think a lot of those like sort of save me 2 or 3 hours of annoying. Like, that's where we start. And by the way, the launch, to your point, was sort of everywhere, to the point where I was kind of overwhelmed and didn't even know, was this the biggest thing that ever happened in ad tech? So I'm glad we're here, because I was going to ask you, is this as big as, the launch?
Just by the numbers, this was the biggest launch in ad tech history. I was actually catching up with Chris and Tim yesterday. And as of yesterday, there was 150,000 cumulative views of the video. By the way, a 12-minute video. So this wasn't like a 60-second, teaser or highlight reel or something like that. It was a 12-minute video. And with a lot of the comments, if you look across like X and LinkedIn, like people were actually watching this thing. So I give these guys a ton of credit. They just kind of captured lightning in a bottle with respect to like a demo that was very, I think, friendly to, this type of launch, and then a good strategy. And to your point on the product itself, I think it was really good that they showed how you can automate the planning piece and attach it to, what is, sort of now effectively driven by AI in terms of the bidding and the optimization, and, give a glimpse into the future. So I was super impressed too.
I would also say that, that maybe 3 months ago this summer, we had Stefan Pretorius, the CTO of WPP, on the show. We had a whole show about AI and agencies, and they're investing a lot of money, these big holding companies. But let's see it. Come on. get on stage. What are you doing? Like, let's see you create a media plan using your AI. You have more data than Viant does, probably, and the tools are open source. Let's see the WPP AI. Why don't you demo it for us? Come on the show. I want to see it.
I think that's right. But I think a launch like this only happens once. So somebody's going to need to come up with a more creative way to do this. So good job to them. They captured lightning in a bottle for sure. Okay, moving on. TTD. So the drama continues with TTD. Will they or won't they build a TV OS? Janko Rokers, again, Janko, sorry if I botched this one. He's back with another scoop that says Sonos is teaming up with TTD on a TV streaming device. So Jeff Green said and I wasn't there at the London conference. I don't know exactly what he said, but the headline was that they weren't building this. It sounds like they're building it. So the idea is it's a set-top box that's integrated with the Sonos home theater products. So, ultra premium user base. And TTD is supplying Sonos with the core smart TV OS, facilitating deals with app publishers, and Sonos is taking care of the hardware and the user interface. And if it happens, it's expected to happen fast, like Q1 fast. So we're going to find out if this thing is real or not in a matter of months. What do you guys think?
Well, I think it's interesting that the code name for this project is Bridgewater. Bridgewater is known as the hedge fund that brings some of the greatest minds towards trading. So I connect the dots and I say this is a hedge. This is a way to hedge the investment in TV and to make sure they don't get cut out by the ecosystem that may have other options. That's my hot take.
Can we go real crazy hot takes on Trade Desk?
Please.
Okay, so imagine we're sitting in the Trade Desk board meeting like 6 months ago, and we're looking at all of the sort of channels we've been crushing through, right? And there's only so much more space in our channels because they're growing so fast mathematically that if they have, let's say, a third of the share in the sort of quote unquote open internet market, there's only two ways to go, which is to take 2 more thirds, which is 2 years worth of growth, to increase CPMs, which means like, let's launch TTD 100 and try to squeeze numbers up, to increase margins, which they're great at, but like there's only so much to go, or you have to start cutting into markets that you're not in. Jeff was just in India for 3 weeks. I don't know, but India is a pretty big emerging market. And when companies typically go to emerging markets, it's because their core markets aren't growing and they have to jump on some new expansion mechanism. And if they look at the TV space, being one of the partners for a lot of these different streamers, that's not going to be good enough. Like they're going to compete with DV360 and Amazon and others on Netflix. They don't have a competitive advantage. So Jeff's just looking at this. I guarantee he's hoping that Freewheel, Xandr, or GAM comes in the market in the next 12 to 18 months that he can go buy, because it's another way for him to start consolidating the stack. I mean, he has to, because you have to go out of your little vertical. And even if he bought every other company in the space, it wouldn't give him enough growth to go do anything. So I think this is, you're right, Ari, it's a hedge, but it's not even a hedge. It is a, large company looking for growth in every possible spot and being very careful about M&A for good reasons. The problem is at some point you just have to acquire or acknowledge that you're going to be a value stock. And, that's where they're sitting.
Yeah, you don't want to switch from growth to value abruptly, because that's a multiplier squeeze. One thing that you just said got me thinking, which is one of the lessons I've learned in my many years in ad tech, is that the same business model doesn't translate across the world, and that there are very big differences by region. And it's possible that this is a non-US strategy, this TV OS. India, you can go into other places where maybe there's not as much ubiquity of CTV or the devices are too expensive, and go with a totally different business model that may be appropriate in other regions of the world that won't work in a developed country like the US.
That's a great point. But that's exactly their mindset is going to be, how do we find large growth? They can't do small growth anymore. It has to be massive pockets of growth where they can see billions of dollars of upside because they're so freaking big. I would like to be in their board meeting and see all of that, because, when you're growing that fast, there's just not many things big enough to get you excited.
Is there anything bigger than a TV OS and or, kind of all in international expansion that they could do?
honestly, they've done everything that makes sense. I remember a day at AppNexus, we had a strat planning meeting with Dwight Porter, and we had this guy, Samir Shergill, another actually AppNexus founder. He's at HighBeam now. He did a spreadsheet. He was in charge of emerging markets, and every single emerging market was like a good market. But the aggregate value of us doing any emerging market was less than spending the exact same amount of money in Europe, the US, Canada. So we never, ever invested in those markets because they were never good enough to justify it. So I'm just saying, increasing investment in those markets, like with a sort of incrementalist strategy, I guarantee they've already done everything that made sense, like based on the previous premises. So there is something, I think, Ari, you're right. Like this has to be a big play and in India, or a big play and in TV. Like Sonos as a TV would be a late entrant into the TV space. Like I already have an Apple TV. I have a smart TV. I think I probably have a Roku lying around. Like I don't need a Sonos TV. And I do have Sonos thingies in my house that work like a third of the time. And so all I'm saying is like, that is not a strategy to go build Sonos, a new entrant TV. That's exactly like Microsoft building Netflix and ad server for a brand new ads business. Like that's not how you do it. You've got to win large existing players. So that's their strategy. Use Sonos to test. And then so my question is, which of the big ones do they think they're going to win?
Yeah. Which piece of the market, which geography, how much of the value chain? Those are kind of questions that should be on the board when you're thinking about this. You mentioned Strategy Week. This is off topic, but like, did you used to dress like a shark for Strategy Week?
We did that one time. I thought
come on. One time you dressed like a shark, and people say you have a shark thing.
It's Shark Week, Strategy Week. I don't know. I'm always, you've got 400 people in a razzle dazzle like space. Like, how do you get people to like get off their laptops and pay attention? You walk out with a shark costume on, people will take your. Ari, they took it seriously. I know it doesn't make any sense.
Seriously when you wore a shark costume.
But that's how
the rest of the time they didn't take it seriously.
Yeah, that's how they literally respected me. That was actually an increase in the level of respect I got for like that day.
Do you still have the outfit, the costume?
There's so much stuff was left in that office. I'm sure whoever like took it over, I think it was Ramp. Like they went into that supply closet and they found some crazy stuff. We had AppNexus onesies, like pajama onesies. Like we had some very odd things that, marketing came up with over the years. So I apologize, Ramp. It's a great office. Just don't go in that closet.
We sold beeswax during COVID. So I showed up as like a year later with my badge still working, and there was like a layer of dust on everything. No one had been there for a year. And I just like took all the swag I wanted and brought it home. But that office was like a nuclear bomb hit it. It was so strange.
Unbelievable. All right, we got to talk about Kubian. All right, you can take your victory lap. Do you want me to set the stage? Or you just want to start?
I'll just talk about it. So I don't know why this company got under my skin, but they were public on NASDAQ. They were talking a big game about how they had unique bidding technology and they had this amazing anti-fraud thing. But if you read their S1, it was like copy and paste diagrams from probably other people's presentations showing like buy side, sell side. They had like $1 million in revenue from like one customer. I think it was the U.S. Post Office. They were hiring people. I had friends call me like, hey, I got this great job offer from Kubian. Should I join? And it was just so obviously a penny stock fraud. And the guy who founded it had stiffed me for like a bill for like $5,000 at Beeswax when his last company went out of business. And I just knew this was bad news. And I was tired of companies like this ruining the reputation of the good ad tech companies. So they went sort of bankrupt. They announced a merger with a Las Vegas-based digital out-of-home company. I forget the name, but it seemed like a legit company. And then that merger got called off, and then their auditors resigned, and then they got delisted. And then it turned out their cap table was entirely like Saudi people. And now the CEO is going to jail because the Southern District of the federal government has come to a plea agreement that effectively 100% of their revenue was bogus round tripping with some ad tech vendor. I'd love to find out which ad tech vendor. They didn't say. But apparently of that incredibly large $1 million of revenue, it was almost entirely by buying some services from a vendor and then selling them ads and calling it revenue. So good riddance. And I'll tee up who's the next one on my target list, because if you go public and have sub $5 million market cap and say you're an ad tech company, I got my eye on you.
Specifically, what they say happened and what the CEO is being charged with is is 1.3 million. He basically did a deal where, he gave 1.3 million to a company, and then that company bought 1.3 million of some sort of product from Kubient. And he's being charged with one count of securities fraud. There's probably more counts, but one count of securities fraud is 20 years in jail.
Didn't he plea? Yeah, he pled.
He pled
so
guilty.
He's not being charged.
Yeah. So who knows what?
He hasn't
what
been charged yet.
Correct.
All right. There's a lesson for you startup founders. Play it safe. Don't go to jail. Don't do illegal things. It may be tempting. You're better off going out of business than doing something illegal.
Yeah. And then another head scratcher, maybe not a head, that one wasn't a head scratcher, but this one is a head scratcher. OpenWeb, who at one point was or is valued at $1 billion based on their next round. They had an announcement where there was a new CEO, but the current CEO refuses to step down. So there's two CEOs.
Oh, man. And this is a company that was invested in by like Samsung, I think, and New York Times. I'm not sure about Samsung. Definitely New York Times. And they've got Scott Galloway on their board. And I'll say this without any snark. They claim to make money by putting ads in comment sections of news articles. And they're based in Israel. So you might want to connect some dots. I'm not going to connect any dots.
My dad's a corporate and tax law professor, like super fun at parties. And when I was doing AppNexus, he gave me this long lecture about like stock and like control. And he gets called as an expert witness on these crazy trials where like, the CEO of Disney gets fired, and like they come after each other. There's a merger of, HP and I don't know, some other company. And like it's always about control. And he has these horror stories, like again and again and again, about why you should be 100% in control of your destiny as a CEO. And it's funny because I heard him exactly the opposite way, which was I want to be completely accountable to my board and investors for my activities and for my outcomes. He's like, well, what if you get a nasty board member who wants to fire you, or someone does a horrible private equity takeover and you lose your business? And I'm like, well, I'd rather take that risk than be in the position where I think I'm, a dictator or emperor, or I'm not held accountable. Because I think my biggest fear is always accountability. And I mean accountability not just to my board, but to my employees, to the community. That's why I'm so committed to open source and transparency, even if it means getting called out sometimes. I'd rather be open and accountable than go to jail, by the way, or be in a situation like this where I'm at odds with my board. And we don't know the history, we don't know the story, but I do think this is a great corporate governance and accountability question of, what is the obligation of leaders to do the right thing and to align with all of their stakeholders. So I don't know, there's a lesson here. I don't know what the story is. I kind of want to know, and I kind of don't care. What I really want to know is, how many of these ad tech companies that we're talking about and we see every day are struggling? How many of these businesses are looking around the same way everybody else is, going, how do we actually find ethical, responsible ways to grow? What if we recognize things that we're doing that aren't ethical and responsible? Can we afford to stop doing them without getting fired? And so that's my question for the OpenWeb board. And I'm sure they're great people. Whatever that happened, did you know about it a year ago? Did you know about it 2 years ago? Are you only pulling the trigger because numbers are down? Like, what's really going on in every board member? And Eric, you're in a bunch of, companies. Like, what I tell founders is this: like, assume it's going to get found out. Assume it's going to be transparent. Act like you work for the company, and do the right thing as fast as possible so that you don't get your ass fired. And you're not actually going to jail, but also that your company can thrive as a good actor.
Yeah, I think that's a really well stated point of view. I'll say something a little more pointed, which is that I think this company probably has a lot of very low quality revenue, and they sold it to their investors as high quality revenue. Then maybe that's coming to an end. If anyone who's listening to this actively buys ads from OpenWeb, let me know. I'd love to hear what your experience is. I want to see someone who's signed an IO with OpenWeb, because I've never met anyone who has.
Yeah, or publishers who use OpenWeb and are getting incremental revenue because we don't know what the revenue model is. I think it's a great point. And just to double click on what you said, Brian, perhaps with the benefit of experience and being older, the reputational damage that, one bad decision that, you sort of refer to with what you're talking about, can be a career killer. You'll never get another investor to invest in your business. You'll never be able to recruit the right people. Nobody will want to be on the board. So I agree completely. And like the sort of reputational damage is, it can be the end.
One more thing I'd love to add is just, there was a moment at AppNexus where I had gone deep into this sort of consistent signal that we had some bad activity on our platform. I had data scientists on it. I had smart people who kept saying, I got it, I killed it, I got it, I killed it. But I wasn't convinced. And I actually started every Saturday morning going home and doing my 60-second check. Could I find fraud or other bad activity in 60 seconds of digging in the database? And I always could. And I yelled at my data scientists as long as I could. And I finally said, what's the root cause? It's the same bad actors doing the same bad things. And I fired a huge number of customers. I said, I don't trust you. I don't want to do business with you. And we lost tens of millions of revenue. And I had to lay people off. And I sat on my kitchen floor and wept because it was so horrible. You know what the industry did? All the people who, I did the right thing. It took me too long. I could have done it sooner. Everyone called me out and said, you admitted you had fraud. And it made me feel like I should never have admitted it. It did not create a safe space where people can acknowledge that they have a problem. And so actually people looked at that and said, well, I'm never going to clean up my act because people will call me out. And I just want to remind us that in a community like this, like, yes, we have every right to call out Kubient for lying and self-dealing and going to jail. We also should celebrate people who acknowledge they do the wrong thing and fix it and are open about it, because that's the only way we're going to see progress. I think there's so many aspects of this industry that are not obvious what you should do. And so I would just say, let's create a culture where, when people do say, hey, I screwed up, that we don't then throw them back under the bus, because I was already on my floor crying. I already felt like shit. I don't need to be then penalized commercially for 2 years because I admitted I used to have fraud, but I actually admitted it, unlike everybody else who had the exact same problem and just pretended they didn't.
Yeah, I think the issue is, what gets clicks on headlines, right?
PR matters a lot. There's a lot about how you say something that changes the way people hear it. And, I agree with you, though, totally, Brian. There are companies right now, and I even put this in my newsletter. There's companies like DV and IAS who have a huge opportunity in front of them to do a better job of what they're doing. And I'm encouraging them to do that, but they're not doing a great job of it by being less transparent than they can and less friendly to the people who are on the wrong side of their reports and doing a lot of other things. But that's another example where they're good companies, they're profitable companies, and they have this window of opportunity to improve themselves enormously that I'd love to see them jump through. So that's one example that comes to mind. I think we're going to have to call this because we are going to our time limit. So what didn't we get to, Eric?
Oh man, you got to put a bunch of stuff in the newsletter. Roku rolls out Ads Manager. YouTube confirms pause ads. Publicis acquires Mars United Commerce, a couple other things. So it was a big news week.
All right. Well, we'll have to get to it next week or we'll go in the newsletter. This was an awesome conversation. Brian O'Kelly, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts here.
Thanks so much for having me. I promise I won't fire you again, and really appreciate being here.
I'm looking for a job, man. Maybe I could be like PR manager for Scope 3. We'll see. And then you can fire me.
Lifetime employment.
Eric, thanks for being here.
Awesome. Thank you both. And goodbye, everybody. See you next week.
See you next week.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.
Thank you for listening to the Marketecture podcast. New episodes come out every Friday, and an insightful vendor interview is published each Monday. You can subscribe to our library of hundreds of executive interviews at marketecture.tv. You can also sign up for free for our weekly newsletter with my original strategic insights on the week's news at news.marketecture.tv. And if you're feeling social, we operate a vibrant Slack community that you can apply to join at adtechgod.com.